It is 2/21 of 2015. We've had a chance to look at Robert Jenson's Systematic Theology, Volume 1, his Doctrine of the Triune God. We looked at it in 4 separate mini-sessions and got a chance to look at it in detail. But now it's time to get the picture, because a lot of times we apprehend an author better if we just get the image of his position. And so we want to take all 4 sessions, consolidate them into one brief session, and get a true picture of Robert Jenson's summary, conclusive grammatology, his theology as grammatology, with regard to the doctrine of the triune God. And by doing so, I think we're going to get a better image of what is taking place in his theology. So it's obviously going to be broken down as 3 moments: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I'll give you the headings of each of the moments, and then we'll look at them in detail. 1 will be the Father as the agent of temporal action. 2 will be the Son as the closure and coherence of God's promissory temporal action. And 3 will be the Holy Spirit as the verbal agency of the promissory temporal action. Now let's take a look at these in detail, but at the same time, not too much detail, but just enough detail to give us a good thought picture image that we can hold. Now if we look at Father as the agent of temporal action, we learn from Jenson that we are supposed to take part in an affirmation. God is intrinsically understood as triune, which identifies his intrinsic intentionality to go out of himself in incarnation. God is intrinsically understood as triune. That illustrates his intention to go out of himself in incarnation. We are also to take up a negation under this heading. The Greek metaphysical concept of impassibility is to be negated in that it contradicts God's triune nature. Third aspect we're supposed to give attention to is writing. The members of the Christian community are to recall, reappropriate, and rewrite the temporal narratives to articulate the God who is with us in our temporal historical existence. The God who is with us in our temporal historical existence. And under this third aspect of writing, we've got 2 subpoints. We are especially to reappropriate the blatant, the way he puts it, the blatant temporal event of Christ's abandonment on the cross and then the resurrection, as that event essentially belongs to God's identity. The blatant temporal event of Christ's abandonment on the cross and then the resurrection that followed is that event which essentially belongs to God's identity. This self-identity constitutes the promise of the grammatology. So his doctrine of the Father defines for us the promise of the grammatology. Now, under the second moment, the Son as the closure and coherence of God's promissory temporal action. First point, the content of closure, crisis and resolution of the crucifixion and resurrection makes up the content of closure. The blatant temporal event is resolved through the resurrection to become a specific eschatological future which is anticipated by the Christian community. So the blatant temporal event of crucifixion is resolved through resurrection to become a specific eschatological future, which is anticipated by the Christian community. Now, second point under the Son is the openness of closure. Closure creates an open future in our temporal history. Our visual sign image is appropriated from the Judaic faith, according to Jenson, and it's the visual sign image of the Shekinah glory of God dwelling in a tent tabernacle during Israel's desert wanderings after their liberation from Egypt. It's the visual sign image of the Shekinah glory of God dwelling in the tent tabernacle during the temporal wanderings of Israel. Now, for the Christian church, this doxa glory accompanies us in our temporal wanderings as, according to Jenson, as God's grammatic signs of the reoccurring word of promise. As God's grammatic signs of the reoccurring word of promise. Final point under the sun is the trajectory of the closure. Dikaiosune, or communal righteousness, is the trajectory of the Christ event. It means to have faith in being directed by God's drastic future openness. Jenson articulates this as the drastic future openness that the Christ event opens up. We are guided by the epiphany of Christ's prophetic eschatological image, and I think as Christians, and especially for Catholics, I think we'd understand that this would be the image of remembrance, and Jenson says we are guided by the epiphany of Christ's prophetic eschatological image, the image of remembrance, that we do call up to help us to be guided toward this communal righteousness of being directed by God's drastic future openness. That concludes this son. We move on to the third moment of his grammatology, which is the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is the verbal agency of the promissory temporal action. The verbal agency of the promissory temporal action. 1. Glory. God's Shekinah glory settles with us as Shekinah signs within our temporal history. Point 2. Word. As Shekinah signs, God's glory appears as Logos Word. So Shekinah sign becomes Logos Word. And Logos Word is understood as a grammatical speech act that points to a place beyond itself. It points to a place of Shekinah within God's creation. So its Logos Word is a pointing sign-like word that points beyond itself. Now our response to the grammatical speech act is always communal as the church body of believers. Our response is a recital, a reflective practice of recital called witnessing and proclamation. In other words, our grammatical mission. Now, grammatical mission is participated in through understanding of Christ's modalities. And he gives us a list of Christ's modalities and a brief summary of those. Number 1, the suffering servant. The promise of resurrection and atonement is taken up in an attitude of sacrifice. Second modality, Israel's coming king. The raising up of David's fallen hut is an image for our focusing on establishing the Dikaiosune righteousness. 3, the space of blessing. The space of blessing is extended to the furthest ends of creation. God's glory, Shekinah glory, seeks to present itself and be present throughout all temporal existence. And then finally, righteous judge is to be understood as actually being faced with God's Shekinah glory. And when being faced by the Shekinah glory, we will either experience a created movement toward righteousness, or the result in destruction. He describes this righteous judge modality as a whirlwind that always agitates in one direction or another. It's either going to be the creative movement or destruction. And that gives us a much better picture of his theology as a grammatology. We have this concentration on the temporal history, and we have the promise of the grammatology. Then we have the prophetic eschatological image of that grammatology as an image of remembrance. And then we have the verbal agency of the Holy Spirit.